Welcome to GLOBEWATCH with me, Charles Ebune, and this is 2018. The centenary anniversary of World War I is being commemorated, and there is a possibility of a rematch to see what the then American President Woodrow Wilson simply qualified as the war to end all wars. Well, the troubles we have in the world today are quite challenging. Climate change, global security, rising terrorism, me first, others second, we and them, us and they. Such expressions are very recurrent. Society entails people live together, but the current political, economic, and social constraints provide a very difficult terrain for top policy makers like my guest today to find a common entente cordiale to produce a world model because of the pluralism debates in which everybody wants his own share in a world full of many factions. How do we produce a model suitable to everyone? Prime Minister Charles Joseph Clark, welcome to GLOBEWATCH.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
I start with a quotation from yourself. It has been my ironic lot to be seen as both a statesman and a scrapper. The statesman is the more respectable reputation, but the scrapper is what these last 4 years have required. This is your speech in 2003 during the leadership convention of your party, precisely May 30, 2003. Each time you sleep today, as a former Prime Minister of Canada, what preoccupies you most?
I agree with your concerns about the turbulence in the world now. There was a period when we had made a lot of progress in bringing differences together. We have to continue to do that, but we also have to recognize that there are now at least two new sources of turbulence. One of those, I think, is related to social media, which has connected people who might have felt outcast before, but now are connected not so much in positive goals, but connected in protest. And they know that things that upset them also upset others. So that is one thing that's happened. The other thing that has happened, though, is that we have some real proof of the value of organizations, people working together. There are some very effective instruments that have been put in place. Suspicions have grown about them. There are suspicions about government everywhere in the world, and there is an obligation, therefore, for people who serve in public office to make an extra effort to earn the respect of the people they serve.
You just raised two concerns there. I asked you that each time you sleep today, what preoccupies you most? There are so many challenges: climate change, security, secessionist movements, the world of uncertainty in which we live. Each time, and I repeat the question, you go to bed as an elderly statesman, 3 times older than myself. What strikes you most? What worries you most?
One of the advantages of being 3 times older than you, I think, is that I have been through crises before. That isn't to diminish the importance of any crisis. What worries me most about modern times is that turbulence seems to be rising, whereas in earlier times we had been finding ways in which different groups came together. And we have to recognize that first, there are new factors causing turbulence, but secondly, that necessity of drawing people together, of understanding why you might have an attitude that is different from mine, and then coming to some agreement about that is so important. That's been my experience. You quoted some language that I used about having been scrappy. I was scrappy in the context of a very important constitutional debate in my country, where I had some views that were not shared by the government at the time. I was the leader of the opposition. We found a consensus. We found an agreement. And we did that by very serious debate that respected the positions of other people. Later on, when I served as the Constitutional Affairs Minister of my country, we took extraordinary steps to draw together people who had been excluded before, bring us all around one table. And in that process, we secured unanimous agreement, among the leaders of indigenous people, of our provinces and our national government on some very basic issues. So I worry that the things that have proven their worth in the past are now losing some of their grip. But I am reassured by the fact that if we take consultation and inclusion seriously, we can draw people together.
Well, you just used a word there, ideology, and this is what you said to the Edmonton Post back on July 29, 1998. These are enough natural divisions in the country without political parties creating new ones. And I think Britain quite legitimately has ideological politics. Europe legitimately has. Canada and the United States have not historically had ideological politics. Explain to me the turmoil, the cracks we see to be in the transatlantic alliance.
Of course there are different perspectives, there are different countries. Are they antagonistic perspectives? Not necessarily. The Trump phenomenon is quite exceptional. He is a surprise to Americans, he is a surprise to people who have built up a respect over the years for Americans. He is, of course, the president, and he has that authority, but I don't think it is fair to judge the profession of leaders by a case like his or a case of some other exceptional circumstances. The situations of Mrs. May and Monsieur Macron are quite different. Naturally, people who come from different points of view and are approaching a common problem are going to come at that from a very particular perspective. But they are seeking to find agreement.
Do you think that what is going on in Europe today is a perfect translation of what Henry Kissinger, former U.S. National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, once remarked that if I want to call Europe, I don't know who to call? Is that actually what is happening today as a former Canadian Prime Minister?
There are no perfect situations. Mr. Kissinger was talking about a situation in which there was a capacity to draw together people who had disagreements but who were prepared to discuss them. Is there a preparation to discuss issues in a transatlantic context now? By and large there is. President Trump appears to be the exception, but I think he should be regarded as someone whose style is quite new in the politics of Western democracies. Is there a need to worry about transatlantic differences? Yes, there is. There always is. One of the reasons that Canada has played an active role since the Second World War was that we were in a position to encourage people how to build things. We were in a position to interpret the Americans to the Europeans to the Americans. That kind of interpretation is necessary again, and not just, of course, between across the Atlantic. Those interpretations are very critical between, for example, Africa and the rest of the world. Africa is transforming. Africa clearly is the continent of the future. That's because of the young population, because of resources, all of these kinds of things. And yet there has not been enough common ground found. In the early days, in the post-war, post-World War II period, we sought common ground, and by seeking it, we found it. And there has to be, I think, a determination to find common ground, similar common ground, now in the face of all these conflicts. We can't simply lift our hands and be alarmed. We have to say, here's a new challenge. We faced challenges before. We did it by trying to understand what is motivating the person on the other side, and then sitting down with them and discussing how we might go forward together.
At the wake of the 9/11 attacks in the United States of America, which killed plus 3,000 people, then U.S. President George Walker Bush remarked that America has no truer friend than Great Britain, and someone can say that America has no truer neighbor than Canada. Today, the Trump administration says that there should be a kind of renegotiation, or if not total abandonment of the NAFTA, the North America Trade Association or agreement concluded roughly 20 years ago, and says that the United States has been cheated. Do you see this as a fair assessment of a country with whom you share a daily trade flow of roughly $2 billion?
I think the reality is that there's a negotiation that is going on. It's been entered into by Canada, by the United States, by Mexico. The free trade agreement, in fact, between Canada and the United States, which came before Mexico in that process, was initiated by Canada. And a Republican president, President Reagan, agreed to it and encouraged the support of it. It's naturally...
And today we have a Republican president.
We do, and that's the point I'm making, that this is not simply a partisan matter. It has to do with the personalities of President Reagan at the time, who was a person in the tradition of those times, who brought people together, and President Trump, whose style is quite particular, quite different from others. Will we get through it? Yes, of course we will. Will there be amendments to the trade agreement? Yes, there will be. Is there a chance that NAFTA might come undone? That's a chance. There are always chances.
Do you think, you have walked through the corridors of power, do you think that Donald Trump is fair to say that NAFTA is an economic disaster to the American marketplace in favor of the Canadians and the Mexicans? Is it fair to say that?
That is not a view that I share. It is not a view that a number of Americans share. That's one of the reasons that there is a very active process of finding common ground among those Americans who know the advantages of NAFTA and those who don't. Look, Mr. Trump won an election by making some promises. Some of those promises seemed unrelated to reality, but he nonetheless believes that he has to give effect to his promises, and he's doing that. And we will defend our interests, and they will defend theirs. You're posing questions as though this is a cataclysm that is waiting to happen. We may have an agreement fail. That may happen. But the nature of the strong relationship between Canada and the United States on one hand, Canada and Mexico on another, and Canada and Europe, those relations are very strong. They have to be refurbished. They have to be kept up to date all the time. As I was trying to say earlier, one of the real challenges, particularly for Western countries, is that we have to recognize that our period of dominance of world thinking is declining because other forces are rising. Everyone talks about China. China is very important, China and India, but it is also rising here in Africa. And one of the things I've been interested in for a long time, active in for a long time, is to ensure that there is a much more active dialogue about our future together of Africans and of North Americans and Europeans. I'm going to focus on the North American Canadian side, and I think there's a progress that can be made there.
Can I come in?
Sure.
You just said that Western influence, Americans and whatsoever, is diminishing in the world. And of course, that is well expressed by Donald Trump's pulling out from the Paris climate change deal, pulling out from the Pacific Partnership Agreement, pulling out from the transatlantic trade agreement, pulling out from so many United Nations agencies, UNESCO, Human Rights Council, slashing of personnel. Can Canada successfully take the American place?
We had an experience after the Second World War where Canada was in a position to use our special talents to draw people together. We still have those special talents. They're personified by Madame Freeland and by Mr. Trudeau, and we are applying them where we can. We have no ambition to replace the United States as a power in North America. We do believe that the approach we take to international relations historically is more fitting now. What's happened in terms of the relative rise of countries that are not in the West has very little to do with the policies of Western countries. It has to do with the fact that there is now a pooling together of resources in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere, overcoming poverty, being able to devise new international institutions that is making those countries which had previously looked inward much more able to shape the nature of the world. Canada welcomes that. And indeed, we think that we can play an unusually positive role in connecting the institutions that had been dominant, which we know well, with the aspirations and capacities of what used to be called the emerging and the developing world, and which is now emerging very quickly. I think that can be very positive. I think that in fact, provides the means by which we can address the turbulence you've been talking about elsewhere, where people are unhappy about domestic matters, so look inward rather than outward.
You were with Jimmy Carter as President of the United States and you Prime Minister. You certainly had a kind of political chemistry that worked well. How can Trudeau and Trump figure out a Canadian-American 21st century political chemistry without the constant friction that we see today expressed, especially on social media, and Donald Trump's behavior of Twitter in chief?
There are two kinds of friction. One is related to social media, and that has to do with a large, increasing part of the population that previously had not been engaged in public debate and now is.
That Donald Trump has a Twitter followership of roughly 35 million today. Barack Obama has plus 91 million, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau should have roughly 4 million followers on Facebook. On Twitter.
I've seen those, and that's one source of tension. It's productive tension. That's something we can build with. The other is as old as time, and that is that different nations have different priorities on some issues. On many other issues, we have common priorities, and our success through much of the second half of the last century was to find those things we had in common and to build on them. Are we in a turbulent time now? Is there a need for new kinds of diplomacy? Is there a need for people to look beyond their own nation to a common interest? Yes, there is. Is it hard in some cases? Are there some leaders who do not agree with that? Yes, there are. But is this a cataclysm? Is this something that's going to bring the world down? This is a repetition of factors that we have known before and that we have overcome by looking for and finding common ground.
Well, you have used an expression, turbulence, repeatedly in the course of this interview. And one of the modes of turbulence being expressed today across the political spectrum in the world is the rise of secessionist movements, very disturbed by the current political forms we have. Biafrans in Nigeria, Ambazonians in Cameroon, the Kurds in Iraq. Even there are some people in Kenya who want to split that country and create new states. Even in France, we have a secessionist movement. You have the Catalans in Spain. California pretends to believe in the American political fabrication. You are a former prime minister of a country with a secessionist or breakaway movement. When you were prime minister, what was running through your mind heading a country with a secessionist movement?
I can answer questions about Canada more authoritatively and what happened then and what's happening there now than I can about other countries. I'm very interested in what is happening there. There is no question that secessionist movements in various parts of the world, or people who at the very least are unhappy with their place in the society where they find themselves, those are increasing. And you're also absolutely right in saying that we had those problems once in Canada. We still have them to some degree, but they have been addressed by, first of all, meeting together and talking, finding out what is driving people. That kind of consultation was very important. Then we changed our laws. We changed our laws with regard to official languages. We changed a number of other of our practices. There have been some changes in the relative powers of provinces and of the national government in Canada. We're now facing a major problem with our Indigenous people, the people who occupied our continent before anyone came from Europe or from anywhere else. And I've been very much involved in that process. We are making some progress on it.
Well,
so,
when you were Prime Minister, and you were very much aware of the desire of the people of Quebec to quit the Canadian Confederation within the Commonwealth realms. Your head of state is the British monarch. Each time you went to the office in the morning, what was your principal preoccupation and attitude?
One of the things that most encouraged me during that time and that I remind people of is that the leader of the independentist movement in Quebec at that time, René Lévesque, always called Canada le beau risque. In other words, that was where he would prefer to be if there could be an attitude towards French-speaking Canadians that would make them feel part of the whole. I share that view. I think, that, not without getting too much into Canadian history, I think that there was an antagonistic approach to Mr. Lévesque that was counterproductive. It came up in some of our discussions. I was leader of the opposition at that time, and so I was not at that table, but I had an obligation to make a case to correct it. But we were able to correct it. We have been able to find common ground. I spent 2 years of my life as the Minister of Constitutional Affairs in Canada. I was able to draw people together in a way that got a unanimous agreement, not only among our governments, but also among our Indigenous people. So these things work. And part of the worry about the tumult we're finding in the world right now is that people think that it will prevail. It will only prevail if we don't find countermeasures. And the countermeasures start by building some respect for people who hold a different view, finding out where the common ground is.
One of the thorniest issues that Canada is providing a substantial degree of global stability today is the issue of immigration. When Trump says, I will not take, Canada says, or Justin Trudeau says, I will provide a safe haven for you people. Do you think fundamentally that with the rise of terrorism across the world, with all the troubles we have, Canada can successfully reproduce a model of immigration policy to be adopted by others?
That's an interesting question, because it is the second major infusion of people who were of refugees that we've been dealt with. When I was Prime Minister, Canada led the world in receiving people from Southeast Asia, boat people who'd been cut adrift to die. At that time, there was no particular security concern. We've had a very positive response to refugees from Syria and indeed from everywhere. We are a refugee country, and that's a very proud part of it. The security matters are very real, and care has to be taken about them. But there can be ways in which we can take that care, and it should. And the fact that there might be a risk should not be a reason to step away. There's one other very important point. Canada is a big country with a lot of space. One of the difficulties in Europe, it seems to me, is that it is a very crowded place.
The second largest country by geography after Russia.
We are, yeah. Oh. And now, not everyone would want to live in some parts of the country.
Atati, for example,
well,
that
may come. That may come.
It's been threatened by climate change. It has indicated the other day by Leonardo DiCaprio, who is a well-known actor and environmental campaigner.
No, there is no question that we are in the front line of the climate change matter as others, but we nonetheless, in terms of the matter you had raised, in terms of the capacity to receive refugees, we have a somewhat better capacity than crowded Europe does.
There is so much talk about electoral processes in the world today. What is the greatest challenge to electoral democracy in the world today? Social media?
I think it is taking account of technology. Technology is seen in some cases as a threat, but technology can also be a solution. And we're not going to be able we wouldn't want to, we're not going to be able to stop the broad transmission of ideas. Some regimes like China may try, but that is a very hard thing to do. The better thing to do is to recognize that just as the advent of electricity changed lives positively, just as other technological changes change lives positively, so can social media and technology. We're regarding technology as sort of outside an area of focus. It can't be. It has got to be as seriously considered as some of the other great changes that keep transforming our lives as people.
You were born on the eve of World War II, and probably part of your family served in that war or was somehow affected by the war. You know the chaos of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What message do you have for the current generation
My message would be that there are going to be very serious problems. Some of them are going to surprise us. A lot of them are going to be extreme, and they're going to be very worrying. But the other lesson from our history is...
Do you see the possibility of World War III?
Imminently today, I can't judge that. I think that there is a danger level that is higher than it was before, and among the things that Canada has recently done is declared an intent to draw together many of the countries that had been involved in the Korean War decades ago, to talk about how we, as a broadly based group with Africans there, with North Americans there, with others, might be able to help resolve the issue. But my point is, bad things can happen and good things can happen. That's someone speaking with experience, someone 3 times your age who has had the privilege of living through difficult circumstances and helping find solutions to them.
Former Canadian Prime Minister Charles Joseph Clark, thank you very much indeed for being a guest on GlobeWatch.
Pleasure. Thank you.
It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.